Hey everybody, before we get into this week's episode, I just wanted to let everybody know, for my local listeners specifically, here in Columbus, Ohio, I've been holding a monthly Death Cafe at the main library in downtown Columbus on Grant Street. You just missed this month's. We had it on this past Sunday, September 11th, but October the 2nd, November the 6th, and December the 4th, so it's the first Sunday of the month at 3 p.m. in the main library, meeting room 1A. I will be holding death cafes with myself and some of the other doulas here in Columbus, Ohio. So if you have questions, thoughts, or just want to come talk death with us, you're more than welcome to stop by. Hello, and welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and sometimes humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today we're going to talk about grief versus depression. This is a topic I've actually had on my list of show ideas for quite some time, but just so happened last week an article passed by my eyes on the intertubes exactly on this topic, grief versus depression. I will definitely link the article in the show notes as I usually do, so you can check it out and read it for yourself. It has links to different resources and sources, etc. And the blog that it's on, I highly recommend anyway. The Amateur's Guide to Death and Dying. Anyway, so grief versus depression. So I talked briefly in my episode in Grief and the DSM about how the DSM-5, if you don't know what that is, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Just in case you weren't sure what that was, it's kind of like the guidebook for psychology, psychiatry, counseling, etc. And it's just kind of like a list of all the different mental disorders that there are, what's new, what's not, what's been, changed, because our views on mental illness has changed drastically over time, which thank God, let's go back to medieval times and we all thought it was demons living in our stomachs and we would just bleed. We now know a little more, but we're learning all the time. So that's why there's so many different versions of the DSM as well. So just a little snippet there for you. We talked, like I said, briefly in that other episode about how grief, it's a condition called prolonged grief disorder, PGD, and it's considered a trauma. It's now a recognized disorder in the DSM. If you haven't listened to that episode, I have feelings on this. So please be forewarned, that episode's full of my opinions. So if you disagree, that is absolutely your right. And there's a lot to both sides of that. Again, that was a whole other episode. I've already done that. So let's move back to grief versus depression. This article specifically is comparing PGD, prolonged grief disorder, with MDD, which is major depressive disorder. So, going forward, if you hear me say MDD or PGD, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's dive right in. Before we even get into what the differences are, I guess the important question here is, why do we care? Why do we care what the difference is between each of them? What does it matter? It's basically for treatment and how you treat one versus the other, because they're a little bit different. They have very, very similar symptoms, and that's why they tend to be confused at times. And part of the reason why they developed this new disorder, the PGD, it was being confused with MDD a bit, and they decided to kind of separate that out into its own little thing, I guess. It's the best way to put it. But they are different. They are and should be treated differently, although some treatments are going to be the same. So that said, let's get into what the differences are, grief versus depression. Well, as I said, they're very similar. They have very similar symptoms. Things like, intense sadness, insomnia, appetite changes, increase or decrease, weight loss, sometimes other side of insomnia, sleeping too much, things like that. But they are different. Grief, this is not always true. Everybody grieves different. We know this. Grief tends to decrease over time and occurs in waves that are triggered by thoughts or reminders of its cause, right? I'm quoting that directly from the article, but that is very much true. Grief is one of those things that tends to get lesser over time. or changes, as we can say, because you learn to walk with it, you learn to live with it. And it does tend to come in waves. Now, depression can do that as well. Depression can also be triggered by certain things, which is another similarity. But some of the differences, grief is intense sadness. There's difficulty accepting whatever may have caused the grief, be it a death, whatever the loss is, difficulty accepting that. And again, I'm quoting this directly from the article, but there are other differences too we'll get into. Excessive focus on the episode of grief or avoidance of it altogether. Your girl's an avoider. I am chronically avoiding anything that might trigger grief for me. I'm notorious about that with myself. If there's like a song that reminds me of someone I've lost or a place, I won't go to those places. I won't listen to that song. I will do everything in the world I can to avoid. I already suffer from mental illness and depression. So throwing grief on top of that can just make life really unbearable sometimes. So I will absolutely do what I can to avoid it. And that's not good, guys. Don't do as I do, not as I say. That's not good. So avoiding your grief is a terrible thing to do. You have to face it and accept it. We know this. Anyway, grief, there's also the thoughts of joining the deceased. Sometimes people who are truly grieving will have suicidal ideations because they want to be with that person again. But with MDD, you still have feelings of intense sadness, but it's more of emptiness, hopelessness, like for me personally, worthlessness, feelings of guilt that are not even related to the grief, morbid preoccupation with worthlessness, as I mentioned earlier. One thing that's interesting, this is kind of a physical symptom. I've noticed this in myself and others, but sluggishness, hesitant or confused speech. It can be hard to form words. I know for myself, when I'm in a depressive episode, I kind of feel like I'm like half awake. It almost feels like there's a physical veil over my face or a fog, and everything's just really muted. And so sometimes it's hard for me to articulate things. But anyway, also with MDD, there's, thoughts of suicide. There can be hallucinations or delusions and auditory hallucinations. That's not in there, but that's one as well. And like prolonged difficulty carrying out day-to-day activities. And that's something I've talked about with grief in the past, is when your grief gets to a point that it's interfering with your day-to-day life, that's when you need to start seeking help, because that's when it might be moving into depression. And that's part of what this article talks about, is a lot of times one will lead into the other. Typically grief will lead into depression. I will say, and I've thought about this for a separate episode, there are times when I come out of a depressive episode and then I have a feeling of grief. And I start going through grief. And it's more grief over like the time that I just lost, the strain on my relationships, my job, anything around me. I went through a really bad one a couple years ago, and I pushed everybody away. And even my own husband, my family, like I just didn't want to be around or talk to anybody about anything. It was awful. And then afterwards, as I started coming out of it, I just felt such a tremendous grief because of what I put people through, and there's a guilt to that too, right? And grief for those couple of like that year, it was almost a whole year that I went through this, you guys, and that's a whole year I lost. I could have been doing other things. It doesn't matter. It is what it is, and it's over now. At least that episode is over, but that one went on a while, and I definitely suffered some grief through that. So one can trigger the other, although typically grief is the thing that might trigger major depressive disorder. Now, the treatments are similar, but can be different. There's obviously therapy, cognitive therapy, CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're reframing negative thoughts, learning healthy coping mechanisms. This never worked for me, by the way. Everybody is different also. So please keep in mind when I mention treatments for things or suggestions on how to cope with grief, it might not work for you. Not everything works for everybody. And like CBT never worked for me. It just didn't. I can't explain why. I don't know what it is. It just never worked for me. That's beside the point. It works for so many other people, though. I've known so many people in my life who swear by cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's changed their lives. And that makes me so happy. When somebody finds something that works for them, it just makes me ridiculously happy. Especially when it gets to depression, and this is where that stickiness comes in, where they've made PGD now a diagnosable mental illness in the DSM, is that, it could be treated with medication. And I'm not saying that's bad. For some people, that might be totally necessary, and it might really help them. Antidepressants, SSRIs, SNRIs, things like that. Those might be prescribed for somebody with prolonged grief. But again, this is just my opinion, that would be when it's interfering with your daily life and when it's kind of become more of a depressive disorder. Or if it's unbearable, right? If you're to that point where you just cannot function because your grief is so bad, sometimes this might help take the edge off. There's nothing wrong with that. Medication is another one of those things that didn't work for me. I've taken several over the years, and I had allergic reactions to a couple, and there was one that gave me permanent neurological damage. So I'm a little gun shy on medications anymore. I'm not at a point where I need them, so that's neither here nor there. But again, sometimes these will change people's lives, and that's what they need, and that's wonderful. Support groups are wonderful. This is something that has worked wonderful for me. This has worked great. And again, not something that works for everybody else. Some people don't want to be in a group setting, and some people don't want to talk to strangers about what they're going through. But especially when it comes to grief. I used to go to Al-Anon meetings. I haven't been to one in a long time, but I really appreciated Al-Anon meetings, even if I didn't say a word the whole time I was there, or was barely paying attention to what other people were saying. Just being surrounded by people who get it, people who have been through similar situations that I have, it makes me feel less alone. So if nothing else, just support groups can make you feel a little less alone about things. So they've worked wonders for me. And in fact, I would love to start going back to some of the groups I went to. And yeah, we'll see. Anyway, I don't know if any of them are meeting in person since COVID. That was the thing. They all went to Zoom, and anyway. So there are differences between grief and depression, but there are a lot of similarities, and a lot of times one can be confused with another, right? I know for me personally, grief caused a depressive episode. Now, I already have a history of depression and mental illness, so that's just there. And it can be triggered pretty easily, in fact, I hate to say. But there are differences as well, mostly differences in how it's treated and how it's affecting you. I did find on the intertubes, on psychnet.apa.org, I'll link this too, a brief abstract from the American Psychological Association on grief versus depression and the DSM-5. Citation is R.A. Friedman, Richard A. Friedman, and again, I will link this so you can take a look at it, and you can read the whole thing if you want. But in the abstract, it basically just says, in a common clinical scenario, a patient who has just lost a loved one presents to a physician with mild depressive symptoms such as sadness, tearfulness, and insomnia. Under the guidelines of the American Psychiatric Association's DSM 4th edition, a practitioner would reasonably view these depressive symptoms as grief-related and not diagnose clinical depression. Depressive symptoms are mild and have lasted less than 2 months. Admittedly, this can be challenging for many practitioners to tell the difference between acute grief and depression. So there you go, which is part of why I believe they may have put this in the DSM-5 PGD, because it can be hard to tell the difference if, as he calls it, acute grief. If it's really, really bad, basically, it can be hard to tell the difference between that and a major depressive disorder. He does go on to say, I hate this, grief resolves naturally on its own. I mean, yes, but no. Grief never goes away. We know this. We just learn to live with it. We learn to walk with it. We learn to accept it into our lives. And then he goes on to say, because of the vast majority of bereaved and clinically depressed patients are seen by primary care practitioners, it is critical that such practitioners be skilled at distinguishing between clinical depression, which requires treatment, and uncomplicated grief, which is an entirely normal emotional response to loss. Ta-da! Grief is normal, you guys. It's okay. This is uncomplicated grief, and I'm glad he specified that, because there is complicated grief which we'll get into. And I believe I briefly talked about it in other episodes, but that's something we can get into another time. I actually did stumble on an article that I'll just go ahead and link if you want to read it, on complicated grief versus depression. Complicated grief is basically just, it's grief that's kind of mixed in with depression. Not always, but it's not just straightforward. I lost my so-and-so. I'm hurting. I'm grieving their loss. I've lost such and such. I'm grieving. There's when a lot more is at play than just I lost XYZ and I'm grieving. Complicated kind of describes it. It's complicated. Anyway, I'll go ahead and link that article as well because it's pretty good. I recommend it. So that's pretty much it. There's a lot in common, but there's a few things different with grief versus depression. Grief is triggered by a loss, right? And depression is triggered by a question mark. It can be triggered by a lot of things, but not all the times, but sometimes depression is just caused by, not just, I don't mean the word just. Depression is a chemical imbalance in your brain, and it's something you have very little to no control over. So, well, you have no control over loss sometimes too. Sometimes people are going to die. We're all going to die. Surprise. Spoiler. Sorry. Anyway, so that's about it. Pretty cut and dry, very simple, but also very complicated. There's so many gray areas with this. If you've had grief or have grief and it's getting muggy and you're not quite sure if it's depression or not, go seek help. Find out and let them help you work through it and let them help you not decide, but figure out which one it might be. And then they can help you get the correct treatment started for whatever it is you need treatment with, and whether it's grief or depression. Never be afraid to ask for help, people. Awesome. Well, that's it. Pretty simple. Well, short and sweet anyway. So with that, we will close out the episode today with the Death Deck. I need to just make a little intro for reading the Death Deck and do some cool voiceover with echo effects on there. The Death Deck. Woo. Oh, that's stupid. All right, Nikki. All right, I'm going to shuffle the cards here. We're going to pick one out at random. And today we have hospice. Do you know anyone that has had hospice services at the end of their life? If yes, how would you describe the experience? If no, how would you imagine this experience? I have, not firsthand, but I have experience with people in my life who have been through hospice. As a doula, my clients almost always are on hospice. Not always, but almost always. Hospice is pretty normal for situations where somebody might ask for a doula. Now, that said, my services are not just for people who are dying in hospice. My services are for anybody at any point in their life. Just keep that in mind. Doulas are not just for people who are on their deathbed. I've done consulting work with people who just want to help get their advanced directives put together, things like that. That's neither here nor there. But yes, I have, and I'm actually finishing or starting my training. I went through orientation. I'm starting training to volunteer at one of the local hospices here in Columbus. So I'm very excited about that. I'm happy to give my services as a volunteer. So as far as how would I describe the experience, hospice is, I've heard but not witnessed horror stories about really bad hospice. Part of the reason why I wanted to get into doula work is I spoke to somebody who was telling me about when their father was dying and hospice showed up, just gave him a box, was like, here you go, and left. And she had no idea what to do with any of the stuff. They may have explained it a little, but when you're in that situation, it's hard to retain some of that stuff because you've got a lot going on. This is why you need a doula to help you navigate that. But she had no idea what she was doing, and they didn't offer any help. She had to keep calling back to get people to come help her with this because she was kind of alone with him. Anyway, that's beside the point. But overall, I've just seen nothing but positive experiences. It's been a beautiful and invaluable service where they can come in and give you the supplies you need. And hospice can be inpatient or outpatient. And I've seen both. Typically with hospice, you imagine that they come to your home and they give you the supplies you might need, any medical supplies, any medications, pain medicines. they will bring a bed. If you need a bed, they'll bring a bedside commode. If you need a bedside commode, they'll bring all of the medical supplies you need to your home. But there are also inpatient hospice centers where people can just go and be. And there will be 24-hour nursing care. So in-home hospice does have 24-hour nursing care as well. That's an option. Okay, that's enough of my sales pitches. I don't even work for hospice. I'm a doula. I've blah long enough. Yes, I have seen some beautiful experiences. That's something to think about. If you know somebody who might, not quite be there yet, but will need their services, I highly recommend researching hospices in your area and research them. Like any other service, research them. Make sure they're reputable. Make sure they're good. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you had a lovely week. I hope you have a lovely week upcoming. Please don't forget to check me out on Patreon. I know, Patreon, everybody has it. As always, all my funds from Patreon go to me providing pro bono work to people who cannot afford to pay for my services. You can check me out on the webternets at nikkithedeathdoula.com. I'm on Instagram, Nikki the Death Doula. Check me out there. All that crap is in the show notes. Please tell your friends about this podcast. I'd love to have more listeners. I'm not making a penny off this, you guys. This isn't like my bread and butter, but I just want to spread the message, and I want people to understand that grief is okay. Grief is okay. Remember that. Your feelings are valid, and grief doesn't always have to suck. Thank you. Good Grief was brought to you by me. You can find me online at nikkithedeathdoula.com. Today's episode was produced by me. Research and scripts written by me. Your host is me. Editing and sound design also me. Music is not me. Music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. License information can be found at filmmusic.io/standard-license. Special thank you to my best friend and husband for constantly reassuring me that I don't suck.